Okay, and I am going to go live. Okay, so here we go. There we go. Okay, I am Terry Camerzell. I'm here tonight with Creation Fellowship Santee, and we're a group of friends bound by our common agreement that the creation account as told in Genesis is a true depiction of how God created the earth and all life in just 6 days a few thousand years ago. We met for about 10 years in person at the Creation and Earth History Museum in Santee, California, but took to this online platform in June of 2020 and haven't looked back. God has blessed us with presentations from scientists, doctors, authors, pastors, cartoonists, prophecy speakers, and other talented people who love the Lord and have a message to share. You can now find links to most of our past presentations by typing in tinyurl.com/CF Santee. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, and Santee is spelled SANTEE. You can also email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com to get on our email list so you don't miss any of our upcoming speakers, and we never spam. Joe and Stacy Gaona have been our friends and members for many years. And since Joe's homegoing last year, we always want to honor his memory by mentioning the continuing work of his ministry Throughout All Ages. Throughout All Ages Ministries focuses on reaching people with the gospel, contending for the faith, and stirring the body to love and good works. Although they enjoy street witnessing and other evangelistic events, God has blessed them with the unique opportunity to go into public schools and speak to young people on relevant topics. You can learn more about Throughout All Ages Ministries at throughoutallages.com. Naturally, most of our weekly topics are creation themed, but from time to time, we're blessed with some off-topic presentations too. And tonight, might seem like it's an off-topic one. We had a similar presentation a few weeks ago with Trevor Loudon, who was here and talking about socialism and communism. And we're going to be revisiting that subject with our speaker tonight, Kay Rubacek. She, before I introduce her, I just want to remind everybody that in the Creation and Earth History Museum, there's a hallway that demonstrates some of the consequences of evolutionary thinking and how that kind of thinking can lead to disastrous ends, including communism and socialism. So we're going to be hearing a lot about that tonight, and we just want to be able to connect those dots. If you have questions during her presentation, you can put them into the chat on Zoom or into the comments on Facebook, and we'll ask them during the live Q&A after her presentation. Kay is an author. She's a celebrated author, an award-winning filmmaker, and distinguished journalist for the NTD and the Epoch Times News. She is a third-generation fighter of communism. Her family fled communism in Russia back in the 1920s, and her husband and she fled Australia because of socialism over 10 years ago. Now she is committed to fighting for the truth and repelling all of the components of communism and socialism in America. To Kay Rubacek, America is the last best hope for the world. She is a committed Christian with her husband and children living in upstate New York. Her new book, Who Are China's Walking Dead, is a firsthand account of all of the oppression, violence, and propaganda in China from real victims and their stories. She'll be discussing that with us tonight, as well as a new film that she has called Finding Courage. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to you, Kay.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you for everyone who's joining us here tonight. It's really important that we have these topics, and what a great group of people to be talking to. I've been speaking about this topic really quite a lot since, well, really a lot this year, but it's something that's very close to my heart. And let me just give you a little bit more detail into how I got to this point before I go into the really where my book is at with the title, Who Are China's Walking Dead, which, okay, does sound like a scary title. And people say to me, Kay, sometimes your works are a bit scary, but I really believe that there is a lot of hope when we have faith. And that's the conclusion I'm going to come to. But I will talk about how I got to that point. And so my name is Kay Rubacek, and I've been doing video production and production, even in video gaming and education, nonfiction productions for more than almost 25 years now. And I started doing that in Australia. But I was actually born into a family of Russian immigrants in Australia. And because my family, they'd fled communism, but they didn't like to talk about it. And really, I think that happens to a lot of us. We find comfort and we forget about tyranny. Tyranny becomes someone else's problem. And that's what happened to my family. And as I tell my story throughout the US here, I've had so many people say to me, oh, my family escaped communism too. So in a way, as I tell you my story, you might find some parallels with your family. But one difference is, so I'm finding that my story may not be that unique. Some parts are, but other parts aren't really, from a lot of Americans. But what's unique perhaps is that I'm talking about it. And I hope to encourage more people to talk about their family stories, their history, because it's our history, and really looking back is what we can learn from to understand exactly what's going on around us today. So my family, as I said, Russian immigrants, they escaped Russia in the 1920s. But then where did they go? They went to China. And that was before the Chinese Communist Party took over China. So my family were committed Christians in the Russia before the Soviet Union, before communism took over Russia. And because they were people of faith, they also owned businesses, they owned land, they had to escape. And my father's parents, grandparents, they escaped. Well, and with his parents, while they were quite young, they escaped, and they spent 5 years traveling on foot to get from one side of Russia down through Mongolia and finally find safety in China. It's a long time to be, a lot of that time they were being chased by what they called the Red Russians. These were the Soviet Russians. And what did they do? They were being scared. There was dead bodies hanging in the trees in the forests when they were escaping Russia, because this is what communists do. They want to make us afraid. And maybe the signs at that time, they were dead bodies hanging in the trees. But what we see in modern times may have changed, but the fear factors that around us that make us feel afraid and scared may look different. We may not be seeing bodies in the trees, but there are other things that make us feel afraid. And I'm going to tie that back together at the end of this presentation, because the tactics of socialism that I've seen, communism, really a lot of them haven't changed since the beginning of their strategies in this past century to destroy faith and essentially try to play God on earth. So I'll tell you a bit more about my story. So when my family got to China, and it was both my paternal side and maternal side of my family, they both went to China, but different parts of China. And my parents married in Australia. But my father was born and raised in China, in Northeast China. And there, he was very fortunate to have survived what is called the Great Famine. There is nothing great about it at all. This is a perversion of language. In China, under the Chinese Communist Party, they've had 70 years of socialism. And what happens is language gets changed. It gets perverted. Meanings change, and that forces a change in culture. And that's what happened in China. The worst environmental disaster in our history, probably across the whole world, is the supposed so-called Great Famine in China, where up to 45 million people died. Think about that, 45 million people died over a period of 3 years, a very short period of time. Yet we don't talk about this in school. We don't talk about this in general, about when we talk about the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people have been taught to forget their history, but we've also been taught to forget the history and the crimes of communism. This regime, these tyrannies, have killed more people than any of the world wars, yet they've never been tried for their crimes. So my father was very fortunate to have escaped with his siblings. They had through their church. They had someone in Hong Kong help them come out over to Australia, where they were able to find safety. My husband's family, they were from the former Czechoslovakia, the Eastern European bloc, where the Soviet Russians took over, and they were persecuted. My husband's family were not people of faith, but they knew that communism was wrong, and they didn't want to follow the party line. But my husband's grandfather, his father's father, was a high-ranking official, and if they didn't follow the party line, they were going to be thrown into jail. So they risked their lives, the whole family, and spent 4 months in a refugee camp, and were very lucky to not be sent back to prison. They made it to Australia. Once they were in Australia, my family didn't want to talk about communism anymore. It was someone else's problem. They didn't have to worry about it anymore, and they didn't want us to, as kids, to know about the evils, because my father would just tell us we didn't have enough food. That's all he would say about this famine that killed 45 million people, where he was sometimes having to eat, lucky if they could get a sparrow to eat. They didn't want to talk about it. So what happens now? In Australia, I went to college to do a fine arts degree, and I recognized that something wasn't right. The education I was being taught a very socialist education. I had friends around me who were doing very traditional artwork, and they were all failing. And I was being pushed as a young student. I was being pushed to do conceptual art. And it's not what I wanted to do, but it was more like I was being trained in psychology and marketing. I wasn't being taught art, and yet I was getting high distinction marks. I knew something was wrong. So I left, and I pursued a career in production instead. And through that, I was able to learn. I started to learn about communism and realized that what was going on in the college system for a long time now. When I went to college, it was more than 20 years ago. So what we're seeing in the US college system here is no different, and it's been going on for a long time. This socialist education starts with intellectuals. They get us when we're young. They get us when we're impressionable. They get us when we're trying to figure out what to do in the world, and we're pressing up against authority and wanting to try new things and find our own feet. And that's exactly, socialists know that's when they get us. And they first, in every regime around the world where they've taken over, and even in America where they're taking over in a soft form, they target college students because they always target intellectuals and artists first. You look at every regime, look at China, you look at Soviet Russia, they get the intellectuals on board because they can use the language in a way to express and extol what is supposedly great about socialism. Now, we know it's not great because it destroys the family, it destroys faith, it destroys culture, it destroys religion. And then they target the artists. They woo them with money and fame and influence. Then they pervert them to destroy culture. They use them to spread negative culture. You can see this around you. Look around you with what Hollywood does, what the music industry does. And then they use them, they abuse them, and then in the end, when a regime takes over, they're the first ones to go. They're the first ones to be turned on, because this type of regime, socialism and communism, it has no problem of destroying its own. It continues to destroy its own. It's absolutely nothing like our values. It is a system built on lies, deceit, deception, where lying, cheating, stealing, killing is not a problem. It's actually a directive for communist regimes. And I'll get into that a little bit in this next part, because I then came face to face with China, the Chinese Communist Party. What happened to me was that my family didn't talk about communism. I didn't understand the evils. And then I found myself in a Chinese prison. I was a human rights advocate. I went to China to stand up for the rights of people who were being persecuted. This is in 2001. And my father told me I was naive and ignorant. He was absolutely right. But I went anyway. And I'm a bit of a stubborn person. And I really couldn't believe that when I was hearing stories about people really being heavily persecuted, it was very hard for me to accept. And I felt that I needed to see it with my own eyes, because I thought that could be happening to me. And in 2001, I held a banner on Tiananmen Square, very public place in China. I broke no law. I checked the legalities of what I was doing. I broke no law. But within 30 seconds, I was surrounded by uniformed and ununiformed police. And I was pushed into a van. I was assaulted. I was locked in a basement prison cell. I wasn't on my own. I did go with 2 friends from Australia. And there was others there who came at that time, because I knew there was going to be a group going. So I wasn't completely on my own. I really felt that I had some level of safety, being a Caucasian. But I was naive. I really didn't know the evils of communism until I faced it face to face. And you know what I was holding when I was on Tiananmen Square? There was a very large banner, and I was holding a large banner. I was the last one left holding that banner on Tiananmen Square. And I had these undercover police officers on Tiananmen Square in China, more undercover police officers than uniformed police. So I was being surrounded by ununiformed police undercover, and I'm quite tall. I'm 6 foot tall, and these Chinese police were quite short, and they're coming closer and closer to arrest me. And I look over to see what they're seeing. I was holding the Chinese character for the word compassion. I was arrested in China for holding the word compassion, and I questioned my arrest when I was arrested, and they said, what you said was illegal. Those words are illegal in China. Now, that to me was unbelievable. It was absolutely ridiculous. They tried, I witnessed so many propaganda techniques while I was there. I witnessed so much manipulation. I witnessed, they tried to force me violently and through coercion and through yelling and screaming and all different forms to try and get me to sign papers that I couldn't read. They're in Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. They tried to force me to say that the CIA had paid for my plane ticket to China. Absolutely ridiculous. I had a good job. I paid for my own ticket. My parents, my family, my boss knew exactly where I was. I paid for my own flight. Yet that's what they told me. These are lies, and this is what the system is based on. And I got to see that firsthand. And what did they do? So over 23 hours, I witnessed a lot of propaganda techniques, and they tried to take my credit card and force me to buy a return flight to Australia. I refused. I already had a return flight 3 days later. And I said, if they want me to leave earlier, they're going to have to pay for my flight. And they did. They bought me a ticket. This is the Chinese Communist Party, bought me a ticket to get out of China so that I would keep my mouth shut. Not only that, they took me to get to the airport. They didn't take me through the regular airport. They had a secret channel, sort of backdoor channel, maybe where they would take maybe dignitaries or something. But it was not a public space, a public channel to get onto the airplane, because they didn't want me to say any words of truth. They didn't want me to say compassion to the Chinese people. This gave me a lot of hope that tyranny is vulnerable, because we know that truth exists. And they know, those at the top level, regular citizens, a lot of them have really suffered brainwashing for decades. But those at the top levels of tyranny, of these types of regimes, these socialist, communist regimes, they know that there are lies. Their system is based on lies, and truth will make it fall apart. And I witnessed that in China. It was it was an experience that changed my life. And after that, I decided to turn my video production skills towards exposing the lies of communism and socialism, the human rights abuses, the extreme human rights abuses and seeking justice for the crimes of communism. My family escaped communism, 3 generations, 3 countries, and there's never been any trials for any of the victims of communism. And there's millions, many, many millions of people. And what I found is that it's really, why haven't there been trials? Why don't we have a very clear definition of socialism and communism like we do, for example, Nazism? We had the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II. So we know, we have a definition of what happened during Nazi Germany time. We know what was done, and there was some justice for the victims. And since then, we have a clear definition on what happened in that period of history. We don't have that for the crimes of communism, because communism is still here. And that's what we are facing today. We are facing the long-term goals of certainly the Chinese Communist Party and other elements of the international socialist movement. But the Chinese Communist Party is the largest communist regime in the world, and its eyes are on America. And for that, they need to bring down family and faith. That's what they attack. And that's really why I'm talking to you, because I feel that as you know, as people of faith, we must understand what these people are trying to do, because they are trying to subvert, they are trying to really trick people to think that socialism is inevitable, and that we are made as if we're accidents. They are trying to make us forget that we are made by a divine hand. Each of us have this, you know, we have a mind, we have a brain, we have a spirit, we have a soul. These are the things that the socialists can never remake in their quest to remake humankind and play God, which is essentially, when you read their texts and follow what they've done, as I've done over the past century, you can see that that's what they are trying to do. They are trying to destroy our faith so that it can be replaced with a faith in them. And in China, under the Chinese Communist Party, religions there, faith there is required to be under the regime. The regime, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is the top. And you're not allowed to put God above the party. That is really the greatest shame in that nation, because all the traditions of China were all essentially spiritual. They were all religious faith. That was the culture of China. But when the Chinese Communist Party came in and then did the Cultural Revolution and really wiped out the culture, then the faith was taken away from the people, and it left a huge gap in their souls. And that's what led me to this book that I'm talking about today, Who Are China's Walking Dead? So this book is based on interviews with former Chinese Communist Party officials. Officials like, I interviewed a judge, a criminal and a civil judge. I interviewed a former army colonel. I interviewed a former national secret agent, a police commissioner from the capital city of Beijing, a man who ran not just one, but multiple slave labor prison camps, among other, a propaganda official, journalists, high-ranking journalists and propaganda officials. I interviewed a whole range of Chinese officials. And the reason I did that was because I was making a movie called Finding Courage. And I'll show you the DVD here, Finding Courage. Now, this movie is, actually, this is based, you can see that the image there is in Washington, D.C., and this is a brother and sister, Leo and Yifei Wang. Now, they were victims of the Chinese Communist Party. And their story, I felt, could just show the breadth of persecution in China. And so I was working on this documentary film, But the problem is that the victims themselves couldn't answer a lot of my questions. They could answer all the questions about their experience, which was very profound and very tragic, but full of hope and faith over fear and courage over tyranny. There was so many wonderful elements to this story, but they couldn't tell me how the regime could be so cruel. They couldn't tell me why. Why did the regime set up these slave labor prison camps? And why do they still exist today? Why do they use electric batons? Why do they torture in such evil manners? And why did they arrest me for holding a banner on Tiananmen Square that had the word compassion on it? So that's what I found interviewing. I've actually interviewed more than 100 victims of communism, a lot from China, but also from other regimes too. And often the victims don't understand why they have suffered what they've suffered. And a lot of people in China, they don't, because they have been separated over 70 years from their history. And this is something that we are at risk of if we allow our education system to continue, where our history is wiped out, where like myself, having a very socialist education, I was being separated and being taught that this traditional art forms that I wanted to learn, I was told it's not worth learning. It's not good anymore. You're better than that. You should be doing something different, something new, something greater than that. Lies. Those are all I was being taught lies. So in China, this has happened for generations, a lot longer than what we've seen here. So while I was making this movie, I wanted to understand the lies behind the regime and why they do what they do. So that's when I said, okay, I have to speak to some officials. I have to speak to someone who's done this. I need someone to show me an electric baton and tell me how this works and how on earth they can put this on another human being. And I found them, and I did show them an electric baton, and they did show me how it works. And they explained how it works on a human being and what it does to the skin. And they explained it to me in such plain language. It was as if they were just baking bread. And I was absolutely shocked, because I thought I knew about communism. I thought by that time that I thought I knew a lot more about China. But when you get close to the evil nature of the regime and realize what these people have been forced to do, it's quite shocking. And so in the movie, Finding Courage, there's about 2 or 3 minutes in total of these, mostly gentlemen. There's one woman as well who was willing to go on camera, many more who wouldn't go on camera, but there was a few minutes of them in the movie, and I think they really had a great impact in the movie to explain why the regime does what it does. But I had so many people say to me after they watched the movie, I want to know more about those people. I want to know why they do what they do. And what's their story? Why did they escape? Why did they leave? And I said, no, you don't. And I don't want to tell you. Because I actually sat on this content for 5 years because I didn't want to release it. I just felt it was too devastating, what's happened to the Chinese people and to the Chinese nation. I felt it was, I didn't see the hope in really sharing that here. But after the COVID, COVID hit the US and everyone saw the lies coming out from the Chinese Communist Party, and I follow the propaganda directives in China, and I saw how they were lying directly from the CCP about COVID and how the lies spread here and how we were all affected by it. Then I thought, okay, it's time to release this information, because the hope is that we can learn from history. We have so many examples. But what we didn't have was something that showed what can happen on a more of a psychological level to people, what makes them separate, what makes them willing to follow the regime. And there have been some studies done in the past, but not on people from China, not on the officials. So that's where I felt my studies could be helpful. And that's why I wrote Who Are China's Walking Dead? And before we open up to questions, I will tell you why I called the book that title. So in one interview, and very early on, I was interviewing, it was actually the police commissioner from Beijing. He was one of the officials who was in the Ministry of Security. And in 1989, when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened in Beijing, where 10,000 innocent citizens were killed, including many, many students, for peaceful protests asking for democracy. And he was one of the officials in the ministry who pushed the button to send the tanks and the soldiers out onto the students and to kill them. And what did he do? He called his daughter and said, go out and watch. She was in Beijing at the time. And he said, go and watch the slaughter. And I said, what? Why would you do that? I'm a mother. I would probably do what my parents did. I didn't want my children to see that. But he wanted his daughter to see that because he knew it would be covered up. And he was right. It was covered up. After 10,000 innocent citizens were killed in a very public way, and Chinese citizens knew it. It wasn't just 10,000 people on the square that day. There was many, many more tens of thousands who weren't killed. There were also many more tens of thousands who had been to the square and participated in the protests over 3 months. It was a 3-month protest. And they knew that the students were innocent, but the whole country was forced to lie. And soon after the killing, the massacre, the CCP called it a political incident, and they still call it a political incident. So they twisted the language. Instead of calling it a massacre, a killing, murderous situation, they called it a political incident. They still do to this day. Not only that, they held a show memorial on Tiananmen Square, and I have footage of that in, actually I described that in my book. And it was quite shocking to see this footage, but they had thousands and thousands of students on the square, very young students and soldiers. And they came out to memorialize a few soldiers, just a few soldiers who were killed during that massacre that they called a political incident. They didn't hold a memorial for any of the students or innocent people. And during this show memorial on the square, they made all the students cry out aloud that they pledged their lives to the motherland. They pledged their lives to the Chinese Communist Party, and they will give their all to the Chinese Communist Party. And so this became something that was played nationwide for months on end, where the citizens had to accept that this is the only way for them, which is a lie. It's an absolute lie that China can only exist with the Chinese Communist Party. But many Chinese have come to accept that there is no other way. And so they knew that the Tiananmen Square massacre happened and that innocent students were killed, but they accepted the lies that came on the media across all channels for months on end. And they forgot their history. And they forgot what happened. They allowed the regime to rewrite their history. Now, this police commissioner, he told me, he said, we've become walking flesh, soulless bodies. And I had a translation coming in simultaneously through an earpiece in my ear. And I never stop the interviews, very rarely, but I had to in this case. And I asked the translator, please, can you help me understand this term, because I don't like what I'm hearing. And she said, yes, soulless bodies, walking corpses, soulless flesh. I said, how about walking dead? She said, yeah, that's a fair term. And I thought, well, we can understand that here. And that's why I titled this book, Who Are China's Walking Dead? Because this is what they call themselves. And so I didn't want to look into this term, but I'm a journalist, I have to. And so every other interview that I did after this gentleman, I would just ask, have you heard of this term? Oh, yes, they said, sure we have. And so I found out that this is a term, walking dead, was a term that had been foreseen more than 50 years ago, when communism came in and many Chinese scholars fled the nation because they saw that communism was completely atheistic and that it would destroy the culture because it would wipe out families and it would wipe out religion and faith. And they said, we will become the walking dead. And that's what these officials 70 years later have said that they've become, because they've had to essentially follow the lies of the regime and carry out things that they don't want to do, that they have to lie, cheat, steal, kill, torture, maim, and hurt whenever they're called upon by the party, because they put the party above their own lives and above the lives of others. That's essentially what the socialist regime is. Whether you call it communism or socialism, they have the same goal. And in China, they're controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, but they say themselves they are a socialist state. So my book, Who Are China's Walking Dead, is my journey in understanding these terms that have come out of a socialist country, in the hope that we can avoid the same fate. And I really believe we can, because here, this country was founded, on as one nation under God, and that is the foundation. But I'm very concerned when I see people losing hope, especially people of faith losing hope, because of everybody. We must maintain hope and be able to show that to others. And that is absolutely something we must maintain. And we must maintain our history, we must maintain our culture, we must maintain our language. And that's where I see a lot of hope, that we can learn from the past. And that's what I hope my book can express. And in Finding Courage, it's an example of a family who stuck together, and the family was able to overcome through their faith, but through their family ties, and overcome such great tyranny. That also gives me a lot of hope too. So those are the two works that I wanted to present to you tonight, as well as my story, and I hope that's been helpful. I would very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Oh,
Go ahead, Robin.
that was really good. I remember Tiananmen Square, and I remember somebody saying, "Oh, there weren't that many people." When you said 10,000 people were killed, I'm like, no way.
Yes, that's official numbers coming from an official inside China who leaked that those documents have been declassified. And yes, yeah.
For all these years, I never thought that many were killed. And I actually, a few years after it happened, somebody said to me, well, they shouldn't have been out there. It was too early in the democracy movement. They were pretty much blaming it. And I accepted that. You have really put a new perspective on China for me. I guess I just think of the Communist Chinese Party as my enemy, but Terry, you have to talk.
Okay. Robin had a question. Was there a time that China wasn't communist? What was China like during that time? Have you, in your research, come across some things that you can describe it?
Yes. China, the Chinese, it's quite amazing that the Chinese Communist Party has actually made the people of China believe that China as a nation began in 1949. China has been around for 5,000 plus years. That's a long time. It's existed as a nation. It's had dynasty after dynasty after dynasty, and very, very faith-based, spiritual-based dynasties and emperors. And they've existed well before the Chinese Communist Party, and they would exist very well without the Chinese Communist Party. But it's so interesting how the Chinese Communist Party has made the Chinese people believe, and I hear it from Americans too, I hear it all around the world, where people say, well, what would happen to China without the Chinese Communist Party? Wouldn't it be chaos? And I say, that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party said. You're repeating their words. Where did you hear that? It's difficult because we are bombarded by media all the time. We're bombarded with narratives all the time. And we get stuck in this short-term thinking where we just read headlines and we don't question things, and we don't discuss enough. We're always busy. We're always rushed. And so we're always trying to cut corners. But the socialists, the communists, have a very long-term plan. So yes, China has existed culturally with a very rich culture for a long time. And communism actually was really a Western import. It's not a Chinese thing at all. And what did it do? The first thing it did was destroy Chinese culture and replace it with this atheistic culture that targets the family and faith. And that's what we're seeing the result of. So yes, it absolutely China existed well before the Chinese Communist Party, and I believe it will exist well after it as well.
And I'm thinking, as you're talking about that, I was dusting off some of the memories that from our creation studies, like, because we hear, we talk about dinosaurs and how we're sure that they were on the ark and how they died off after the flood. And one of the ways that we know is a lot of stories from China of dragon legends and stuff, and Marco Polo visited, and so we've learned a lot of history that way too. So it is interesting to think about that. So the next question: the people that you interviewed, are they still doing what they do, or if not, why did they leave?
I was offered to interview some people who were still doing what they do in China, and almost all of them I said no, because it's just too dangerous. And I know other investigators, researchers, people from non-Chinese who have done investigations with people in China, and those people in China were disappeared. They weren't heard of again. And that's happened very often. And I didn't want that to happen. Whether it's selfish or not, I just didn't want that blood on my hands. And so I said no to those people. And I interviewed people who I knew were relatively safe. There were some who still had some visa issues, and they were concerned. They were living outside of China. We went to 5 countries to make this movie. And there was one person who was living in Canada, and he said, I'm really nervous to talk to you because I haven't got my visa status secure here yet. And if you frame me in a way that puts me as a perpetrator, I could be sent back or I could be tried. And but he was still, it took a bit of effort, but he still was willing to talk to me, and very brave man. And he has been involved in some really terrible things.
And do they have any regret or anything like that?
Yes, they do have regret. Some of them are these people who left. A lot of them didn't have hope for the regime, and I thought maybe they'd be disaffected, maybe they would be angry or trying to do something. They weren't trying to do anything, and they had really given up hope on the country of China, and that was very hard for me to accept. I thought that they would be more active, but these guys were the hands and the feet, the operators of the regime. They were very close to the regime. They were the ones who were the fall guys. They were the scapegoats. They know, they have such pressure on them. They know that when something goes wrong, if their superior wants someone else to take the blame, it's them. They'll go to jail. They'll be the ones framed, and they have to shut up and take it. So it's very, very stressful for an official in China. So these guys, but when they come here, they're called traitors. They're called traitors to their own nation, and so they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because they can't go back now. And here they don't know how to fit in, because they have become so, one official said to me, he was a speechwriter for politicians in China. That was one of his jobs. He also wrote legislation and laws in China, and he disciplined other party members. That was his job. And he was in Washington, D.C. at a rally one day observing. And he said to me afterwards, he said, Kay, did you see those American politicians? They spoke without a speech. I said, yeah, that's what we do. He's like, never in China, never, never, never. We cannot talk. He says, I am so scared to talk without words in front of me because I might make a mistake and then I'm in prison. So they are not used to free thinking, they're not used to what we're used to. So it's very hard for them to adjust here. And some of them have, but some of them still struggle. Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I knew a Chinese businessman who was here, and he I don't think he was part of the government, but he did use his home to host an underground church, and he always was nervous if he went back to China that he would get caught even going through customs, that they would know about it and stuff. But while he's here, he's always nervous that the American government is going to suspect that that something's, that he's spying or something, like he's always nervous. Like, just to live like that is, he got his family into freedom, but he still will always have that awareness that his life could change.
Yes, and that reminds me, there's one story I write about in my book. There was a woman who was translating for us at one interview, and it was a long interview for 2 hours, and she came out at the end of the interview, and she was shaking, and she said, Kay, I've been in freedom. She was younger than a lot of the officials, maybe in her 40s at the time, late 40s, and she said, I've been in a free country for years now. And she said, but I just realized that when I say the words Chinese Communist Party in Chinese, she said, I feel a warmth in my heart, the same feeling that I have for the love of my mother. And she said, I didn't realize that before, that I still have it. I hate that. And she says, I don't know how to get rid of it. But she recognized it. And she said, since I was a child, I've been taught to love the Communist Party as my mother. And this is what these people suffer. It's a really intense psychological impact on them, and it's hard for them to come out of it. And some of them, come out better than others, but others still have that fear. But I have seen those of faith have the greatest power to overcome, definitely. And those who have family that are willing to come with them and support each other, those ones, and that's what I found. Anyone who suffered some form of brainwashing, those family and faith are the two very important elements to get them through. So that's very important.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had Trevor Loudon a few weeks ago, and he talked about his, well, not just his, but the film that he was a part of, The Enemies Within the Church. And one of the key points in that talks about how China did a study about American culture and what it is that makes America great, and it's our faith, just like what you said. So, I don't know, you mentioned that as long as we have hope, but I also think that we need to have awareness. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, that China, what they're doing to their own country, but in a lot of ways, they're trying to infiltrate America as well. And one of the things, like we're fans, a lot of us here are fans of Jan Markell, and we listen, and we heard an episode where they talked about the Chinese, what is it, social credits, I think it is, and how banks use that, and there's cameras everywhere. So for example, one of our people, Brian, he wants to know, is it legal for Chinese people to speak about Taiwan or Tibet or the Tiananmen Square incident?
Now, when you say legal, that's something that China's legal system is not comparable to ours. So it's really more like a mafia system, really. When you look at, I've studied the Chinese constitution. There's a constitution for the Chinese Communist Party, and there's a constitution for the government. Now, the government constitution is below the Chinese Communist Party constitution. And the Chinese Communist Party constitution requires that it has national socialist control, absolute control over the nation, and that economic growth, essentially money comes before all else. And so all the laws, I have to really use laws in quotation marks, because laws are twisted in a way that compassion. I was arrested for holding the word compassion. Did I break a law? No. Did they say I did? Yes. There's no law that says compassion is illegal in China, but they twist that. One of the men one of the main characters in our movie, Finding Courage, was arrested for printing flyers, and he was jailed for 13 years for printing flyers. And the torture he received was brutal. And you think, how is that possible? What are the laws like? His son showed me the legal documents signed by the state and stamped by the officialdom, and that he explained that they had tried to hire a lawyer, many lawyers, and all the lawyers said if they represent him, they will be they would lose their license. So there are certain taboos. Yes, definitely things like Taiwan, Tiananmen Square massacre, Falun Gong, Uyghur persecution. If you mentioned in Tibet, these are top issues that are targeted in China. The man in our movie, Finding Courage, practiced Falun Gong, the meditation practice, and that is a big taboo in China. And so because he printed flyers exposing that persecution, he spent 13 years in prison for printing flyers. Is that legal? And so another person, insider, told me, she said, "Okay, we don't know. We don't have the term human rights." She said, "I didn't know that term until I came out to the West, until I came out of China." She didn't know. She was a younger insider, and she told me how she didn't know about the Tiananmen Square massacre at all. She just didn't even know that it happened. And when she came, she fled to Australia. Actually, when she went to Australia, people started to show her, and she had access to information. So yes, the censorship and security and surveillance state in China is very extreme now, and it still is. It was before. It's even more extreme now. And this woman said, once she came out to a free society, she was able to access the internet, and she did. Someone showed her. She didn't know to look up Tiananmen Square. Someone showed her, and she just cried. She just cried and cried and cried when she realized she'd been lied to all this time. And so it's the same, really similar, I think, with the social credit system and censoring of these topics. These are not laws based on, say, for example, we have a constitution, but that constitution is based on recognition of a divine law, of a moral law, and that it needs to be a moral people. That's what the founding fathers talk about in the creation of the constitution. If we just have law of man over man, we eventually get tyranny. It's inevitable. And that's what happens under communism, because they say there is no divine law, there is no morality, they say there is no God, and that the Communist Party has to become the God of the people. And then that leaves only man law over man law with no morality. What are you going to have? It's a disaster. And that's what's happened. So the law in China is not at all comparable to a law here. Businesses, American businesses, are learning that the hard way again and again and again. They're setting up over there. And what happens? The Chinese Communist Party takes over. Well, before they take over the company, they steal all their intellectual property. Not just the intellectual property, they will steal their employees. They'll steal their exact design of the store, everything. And then they bankrupt the company and start the new company, exactly a mirror image of what the American company was. And the American company goes back and loses everything. So this has happened again and again and again. And what are the repercussions? None. The Chinese Communist Party will just fund that business. So that is, what kind of law is that? There is certainly not a moral law, and a law that we would accept here, where we expect people to have a certain level of decency, honesty, to not lie, cheat, and steal. But in China, it's accepted to lie, cheat, and steal. That's where the culture has come to, and the law is in that basket as well over there.
A number of years ago, a documentary was shown here in America about the doctor who was hiding or rescuing babies because of the one child policy in China. Has that policy changed at all? Is that still, you know, and did new, like when we have something like that happen here, where a movie gets a lot of attention and puts a lot of attention on China, something that we don't agree with, like, is China impressed by that? Not like impressed, like, oh, but does it affect them in that kind of a way?
Yeah, great questions. So the one child policy has changed, but it didn't change because of international pressure. It changed because China's population is in a terrible situation. China is in a really dangerous situation. The aging population is very it's huge. And so the country is trying to sustain an aging population, but they don't have social security like we have. They don't have the same systems in place. And so healthcare, everything is really, it's getting into disarray, and the youth are not having children. And so there isn't anyone to replace the new generations. The video gaming situation, addictions in China are extreme. A lot of things are extreme in China. This is what happens under communism. Things go to extremes. They allow things to go to extremes, but then they try to pull back. So instead of, the one-child policy was put into place by Mao Zedong. He could have implemented say a three-child policy or something like that without requiring killing, but instead they went to an extreme, one only. That's a real extreme from before having, lots of children. They could have tried to reduce the population, but they went to an extreme. And in my book, I have lots of examples of different extremes that the regime has gone to. And this was one case. So they went to an extreme, and the number of deaths was just absolutely shocking over this time. But the CCP didn't succumb to any pressure externally. And that documentary came very close to the end of the one-child policy. It was already happening. It was already destined to change, not because of any remorse, but because they knew that the country's population is in dire straits right now. And to your second question about how to do documentary films make an impact, I really believe they do. Whether it's a documentary or a scripted film, they do make an impact. And I can say that as a filmmaker, because I know with the films that I've made, they've been highly censored. Even but it really shows the censorship, the self-censorship that Americans have put into place. I've had many film festivals say to me, "We are so scared to show your movie because we get funding from the Chinese Communist Party." And the Chinese Communist Party funds many film festivals. And we've had others that have said, "Sorry, we won't screen your movie because we will lose funding." I've had colleges call me and say, "I'm sorry, we have to cancel the screening of your movie because we have too many students from China and we will lose our funding from the Chinese Communist Party." Now, someone once said to me, "Well, can you tell me those colleges? Let's shame them, name them and shame them." And I said, I won't, because for each one that did tell me the truth, there's probably 10 others that lied. And the ones that told me the truth, I'm glad that they did. So I don't want to name them and shame them. I feel that there's so many others that have lied. So I just want people to know that there are people that have least said the truth, and there are others who have lied and still are taking money from the Chinese Communist Party. But I can tell you that was a very large film festival who had been taking, I was told, $100,000 every year from the Chinese Communist Party. And then when our film Finding Courage came out, they fired the CCP, didn't take the money, and we won a gold prize. So there's still people with guts, and I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and that goes back to what I was saying about the film that the enemies within the church film, about how the influence that China has over us, and that we have to have our hope, but also our awareness. So um back to the social credit. So the social credit score, one of the things that we heard, like if you see that your neighbor is doing something and then you report them, that helps your score. So when you just back up a little bit, when you said that there's a lot of lying, cheating, and stealing, Pamela wants to know who are they lying to, or cheating or stealing from? Each other, neighbor to neighbor, or how is that happening?
So it's actually been a policy, and it comes from the top, and it goes down to the people. So really, because China has, since the Chinese Communist Party took over, every 5 to 10 years, they have another campaign, a persecution campaign, a political persecution campaign. And so they've targeted intellectuals, they've targeted landowners, they've targeted religious groups, they targeted political prisoners, they targeted students. One of what the really big campaign they had was the Cultural Revolution. And that set families upon each other. They had to snitch on each other. They literally tore the families apart. They had students beating, sometimes to death, their students. These cases are well documented. I'm not exaggerating at all here. Beating their teachers. And this is what happened, and it continued. So during that Cultural Revolution time, the psychological impact on people was phenomenal. It really, really hurt. It really hurt people, and they learned to just accept lies. They were, one of my interviewees told me in one example, he said, my teachers who I loved, who had brought me even into the Communist Party, who had told me to love socialism, overnight they became the enemy, because the party just decided they needed enemies. So that's what they do. So they just said, these are the enemies, and they labeled all these teachers and educators, intellectuals, enemies. So the students had to turn on their teachers. And so this man said, but I loved my teachers. And then I had to, in front of everybody, humiliate my teachers, scold them, yell at them, be brutal towards them, physically brutal at times. And he said, I couldn't sleep for years and years. He said, it destroyed my health. This is just one man's tiny experience in one moment. And he suffered many cases like that for many years. And so when you go through that type of experience, you start to accept lies. When you see, and you know that students were killed on Tiananmen Square, yet the television is telling you students killed soldiers, students are bad, students are being arrested and put into jail, then, and you know they're lying, but if you say anything, you think, well, then I might go into jail too. Shut up. So they tell each other, don't say anything. They say, don't talk about it. So they accept those lies. And that has become part of this communist culture. And so that's where the lying comes in. And so that's why when people say to me, why did that Chinese business rip off my business, my American business? How could they steal my intellectual property? I explained that this is not Chinese culture. Chinese culture is that traditional culture we talked about before, that 5,000 years of very traditional, a lot of wonderful culture. You know, it's very traditional, but then this communist culture, which is this Western import, you know, stemming from Karl Marx and others, that is what has become the most pervasive culture. And that is what is created. This is where the social credit system is just the modern form of what they were doing during the Cultural Revolution. It's the same strategy, but just a modern tactic.
Yeah. Okay, so we have quite a few questions that are different threads, different themes. So let's start.
Should we shut down recording? And
I I think some of these are good questions that we'd like to
Okay.
keep going with. So, how common is organ harvesting in China?
I did a movie called Hard to Believe. I do have that DVD here as well. This is on the killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs in China. And it's now called organ harvesting. It's a form of, it's called transplant tourism. When we did this documentary, the terms were not that well known, but there'd been so many investigations already done that I felt it was worth doing this documentary. And that was screened on PBS. And we found through interviewing investigators that it was, you can still get a heart or a liver in China within a few weeks right now. Even during COVID, you could still get a heart or a liver in China. And anywhere else in the world, certainly here, you're waiting months to years because someone has to die for that transplantation, because that is not a kidney where you can remove one. It's a whole, it's a vital organ. So, and in China, if you can go to a hospital, and if it doesn't work out the first time, you can wait and they'll give you another one. So, and I'm not talking about rare examples. There are this is an ongoing thing. So we are aware that there have been hundreds of thousands, at least, innocent people who have been killed for the sale of their organs in China under policies that of the Chinese Communist Party that allows that. And our transplantation system has turned a blind eye, and they have not held them to account.
You would have to have a totally seared conscience for that. I can't even stand to listen to you say that. I can't imagine people doing that.
That's why we called the movie Hard to Believe.
Yeah. Well titled. Next, have the people in Hong Kong succumbed to the communist lies? What is their current situation?
Oh, Hong Kong. Oh, we need to pray for the people of Hong Kong. For example, there was just last week, a man was arrested for paying tribute to the death of the Queen. You know, Hong Kong used to be under British rule, and many people have, you know, still have great respect for the monarchy. Shouldn't they be allowed to pay respects to someone, whoever they respect, as a fellow human being? But under Chinese Communist Party rule, he was arrested for paying respects to a fellow human being who happened to be the Queen of England. So Hong Kong is in a very precarious situation right now, and I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but we do need to pay attention to what's going on there. It's a real it's an economic center for China and the rest of the world, so it's a very important place.
They kind of just went dark. You know, you used to hear a lot about Hong Kong. For work, I was offered to go. We were opening a new data center there. But I didn't want to spend all that time on a plane. So I hemmed and hawed, and they sent somebody else. You know, and this goes back like 7-8 years. But all of a sudden they just went dark. And is that because China took them back from England? Is that what?
Yeah, so China, yes, China took them back. And then the biggest change was that they put in a new national security law. Before, when China took Hong Kong back from England, they kept this system called, you know, two systems, one country, two systems. And Hong Kong was still allowed some level of autonomy, so that because they were used to British rule, they were used to having Western sense of freedom closer to what we have here. And so a lot of Hong Kong people didn't want to live under communism. They didn't want to live under a communist state. So, but they had to accept this one country, two systems. But when this national security law came in China, which is what those umbrella protests were about a few years ago, around 2018, there was many students all over the streets, and then there was just massive protests of millions of people. They were really trying to protect the history of Hong Kong and the honesty in education. There was a really big uproar, a lot about education too. And they have been silenced largely since the national security law came in. There was, in one example, there was a very large sculpture in Hong Kong in memorial for the lives that were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. That has been removed. That's telling you what's happening to Hong Kong. They're removing history and they're making people forget and slowly making them succumb to socialist rule.
So I know we're getting up against the time, but we have 3 more questions if you're willing to do it. Okay, so one of them is just, does China have a word for love or for God?
Yes, they do. You know, I is love, and for God, it's more divine. I don't speak Chinese, so I don't want to say it. But China has a history for, I mean, there's still Christians in China. There is the underground church. They are persecuted. There is the churches that are officially under the regime have to have appointed Communist Party members that appoint the pastors and the bishops, and that's a I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem. I think that's a compromise. I don't accept that. Now there are underground churches that also don't accept that, and there are people of faith. And yes, those words exist in China. China has a really amazing language. When you look at the richness of the language, and I wouldn't even dare to speak some of the words because my Chinese is really terrible. But yes, they absolutely have a lot of love and they have a lot of faith in the country. And I really believe that it's there. It has been suppressed. I don't believe it's been completely forgotten. What I've seen is that people are wanting. There are those who maybe don't even know what they're missing, but I really do believe there's a lot of people that are wanting that return to tradition, and they want to fill that spiritual void that's been taken from them.
Okay. How large is the Chinese military? Like, considering the decrease in population over the years that you mentioned, how large is the military?
You know, it's funny because China actually spends more money defending domestically than externally. So we are so worried about China fighting, maybe even on American soil. And sure, they're an absolute threat, but the way they are fighting us here is, and I don't actually have the numbers of the military right in front of me, but I know that China spends more on its domestic control militaristically with its security and military targeting its own citizens than it does externally. When you look year on year how much they're spending. If you look at the COVID lockdowns, they are still building now concentration camps, these little boxes of these kind of like trailer homes, but very small, basically one room. And they have them in most provinces across the nation, and they are still building them. And they've built them for quarantine purposes, but they can use them for anything now that they exist. They are putting people, they're sending people there. And this is a big concern because China needs to control its own population to such an extreme that this is what they always do. They put so much into maintaining the good control over the nation. I talk about this quite a bit in my book, is that they care so much about our opinion on the outside because that affects their core base in China. They do not want their base to wake up and realize that they've been lied to all this time. And so they absolutely care about international pressure. They very much care about saving face, which is, a Chinese term for protecting their appearance. And yes, they do want to, and they are infiltrating the US and the rest of the world, but not through this sort of kinetic war. They are coming through subversive means, and that they use this, term unconventional warfare. And that's where the military is also including the police, and they have all these systems domestically to control their own people. That's how they can roll out these COVID lockdowns to such an extreme so many provinces, so many cities across the nation, because they have these domestic control mechanisms already in place. And that's where a big percentage of their military funding goes. And it's just shocking every time I see each year what they're spending on their domestic control. I can't recount those numbers for you right now, because I don't want to get that, I don't want to say them wrongly, but that's really the case. And you can look at that and see what they're spending on domestic surveillance and control, as opposed to their military. But the military is absolutely large. They are certainly working on that. It's very important to them that they have a show of strength, and they're, of course, targeting Taiwan, and they want to look fierce. But internally, there are big problems. There are mega problems with financial situations, with banks being unable to provide people their money in many cities, and riots in many cities, concentration camps going up, COVID lockdowns going to extreme violence. It's really, there's a lot of problems internally, and people are really getting quite fed up.
Okay, so last question, and this comes from Brian Lauer, who spoke for us last week, and he's going to be speaking for us in November about the World Economic Forum. So you mentioned, again, about the infiltration of China in the US. So his question, twofold, is, in terms of China, what is the biggest threat to America? And then also he'd like to know, is China a bigger threat than the World Economic Forum, in your opinion?
Oh, gee, I wish I had exact answers to those. I would love to be in your presentation in November. Here's my opinion. The World Economic Forum is relying on China. It's relying on the CCP. That's what it is relying on. If the CCP were to fall, I don't know what would happen. I don't know how the World Economic Forum would sustain. The World Health Organization, so many of these organizations are really dependent on the CCP. So they are colluding together. Now, who is the bigger threat? I would say the CCP is the bigger threat for sure, because of their experience in enacting socialism upon more than 1 billion people over 70 years. World Economic Forum, as scary as it looks, they don't have that hands-on experience that the Chinese Communist Party has. As brutal as the World Economic Forum seems to be in their writings and things like that, and I don't doubt their sinister intentions, but the Chinese Communist Party has a lot of blood on its hands, and we are funding it. That concerns me greatly. And the biggest threat to the US, it's the money. It's the money from the CCP, and the fact that we're accepting it, and that we're also exchanging it, the fact that we're giving them our money. I'm very concerned about the fentanyl that's crossing through the borders. I was on the southern border last year. I was watching cartel members bring over women and children right in front of me, even with the camera lights on. I was filming. They had absolutely brazen, and we were just welcoming them in. Meanwhile, just down another bend in the river, there was quietly, and we got a glimpse of some of them, they were bringing across drugs, and there were smugglers coming across, and they were not under lights. The National Guard was not paying attention, because National Guard was paying attention, and the Border Patrol, where we were, where the women and children were, that was the decoy. So the amount of fentanyl that is being brought in, and that's killing hundreds every day of our youth intentionally, is being brought in from China through Mexico. And that China, the CCP, is very experienced in drug warfare. So this is a big concern for me, is that we don't always connect the dots between, we have more than 90% of our pharmaceuticals are made by China. That is a big dependence on China. Not only are we manufacturing so many other things in China, but our pharmaceuticals, we are giving our healthcare to China, who look at how they treat their citizens during a pandemic. So they, at the same time, while we're giving them our billions of dollars to give us drugs, they are bringing other drugs in through the border and killing and getting our population addicted. This is not an accident. this is something that they have experienced and documented themselves in their own texts. I've read their speeches, I've read their documents, as they know drug warfare is very effective. And this is what they're using on us. So I'm very concerned that they use money to woo our leaders and get them into compromising situations, and on both sides of the aisle of politics. And that's where we really need to have a moral standard, and we need to have transparency, and we need to say no to the drugs being brought over the border, and we need to stop that. So I think there's a lot of threats, but I say it's our compromising in terms of the money. We shouldn't compromise on that.
Okay, well, that's been a lot of information, and it was very interesting, and we're very blessed and grateful that you were with us tonight, and we want to make sure to support you. So I know that you mentioned your book, and your website is your name, right? krubacek.com.
Yes, that's
And I
right.
saw,
yes.
yeah, and I saw that there's a link on there to buy your new book, Who Are China's Walking Dead. But several people have been looking for the video that you talked about.
Finding Courage.
Exactly, Finding
Right.
Courage. And then you also held up one about and the name again escaped me, but
Hard to Believe.
Yes. So on the Finding Courage, I've been seeing in the chat that people are saying that it's not available on Amazon. But
Amazon has censored it.
But that maybe people can rent it on YouTube or Google Play.
Correct.
Are you
yes,
familiar
and
with
iTunes, and also from our website. It's streaming on our website. It's also on Epoch TV, Rise TV, a few other platforms. So if you go to on my website, there's a page called Work, and my work, and then you can see Finding Courage is there. That'll take you to the web page for Finding Courage. You can purchase. You do have to purchase Finding Courage. That one's still streaming right now, and it did take us 5 years to make the movie over 5 countries. So we are charging for that movie, but it's I think you'll enjoy it. I think that's worth it. And yes, so you will find that from my website, but it's not on Amazon. Hard to Believe was on Amazon, but that was 2015. When Finding Courage came out, we'd seen that there'd been censorship on Amazon. It started censoring content, and especially that connected exposing crimes of the CCP. And so unfortunately, we've been disallowed from having our content there now.
Yeah.
That really is mafia-like. Wow.
So, and then again, one more time, say your website so that we can find you. And yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's my name, KAYRUBACEK. That's krubacek.com. You can find all the links to my work there. You can see the documentaries and reporting that I've done, and you can support me there. You can sign up to my email newsletter there as well. And I'd really love to hear from you.
And follow you on Facebook. I did that today too, right?
Thank you.
So.
Yes. Great.
Okay. And then of course, we're Creation Fellowship Santee. You can find most of our past presentations, links to them by typing in tinyurl.com/CF Santee. You can also email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com so that you get put on our speaker list, and we promise not to spam you. Next week, the 29th of September, will be off, but then we have quite a lineup for the rest of the fall. We have a good blend of creation science topics, current events, and theology. We have Spike Paceris, Dr. Jason Lyle, Nate Loper, Mike Gendron, Bill Morgan, Brian Lauer, and Pastor Tom Lee will be finishing up our fall season by talking to us on the topic of repentance. So with that, we're going to sign off for tonight.